When the team at Steinberg first started working on the application that would become Dorico, they built it in such a way that would eventually allow them, hopefully, to release an iPad version. Here we are, almost 5 years after the initial release of Dorico 1.0 on Mac and Windows, and Dorico for iPad is right here. So let's take a look and see how it works. When you first launch Dorico for the iPad, you'll find yourself on the Dorico hub. This is very similar to the hub the way it exists on the desktop. You can see that I have a list of my recent files. I have a button to open or import files. I can come over here to the Learn tab and I can get some video tutorials and some links to the blog, or I can create a new project from a number of templates or an empty template. So on the Open Recent tab, if I tap to open or import a file, this will allow me to access any file that I can get access to from the Files app. So if you have Dropbox installed or OneDrive or Google Drive, or you can use iCloud Drive, any of these things that can connect into the Files app, you can open a file from in Dorico. Now when you do that, it will create a copy of that file inside the Dorico container. So you can't edit the original where it lives. You'll create a copy, and if you want to get that back out again, you can export that Dorico file back to Dropbox, to an email, to AirDrop, or whatever you want to get it back to another computer. So let's just, for the sake of checking it out, go into Create New. Here you can select from any number of these templates. Dorico for iPad has essentially 2 levels. There's a free level and a paid level. The free level is very similar to the free level of the desktop version of Dorico, Dorico SE. If you upgrade to the paid tier of Dorico on the iPad, that will be very similar to Dorico Elements. Neither of these has an Engrave Mode on the desktop. And they have a cap on the number of instruments that you can include. So if you are on the free version of Dorico for iPad, you can have up to 4 players. And if you have the paid version, you can have up to 12 players. So for checking out some of these new features, let's just go ahead and create a solo piano work. So let's take a look at that. Once you've set up your new project, you can see you're taken to something that looks a lot like Dorico on your desktop. We are thrown directly into write mode, but let's take a look at setup mode first. So just like setup mode on the desktop, you'll be able to see the score, add players, so you can add as many players, soloists or section players as you want. You can add flows down at the bottom. You can add layouts over on the right. Remember that limitation though, you can't add more than 4 players with the free version or more than 12 players with the paid version of Dorico for iPad. Over here in write mode, you'll see things look more or less the same, but there are a few new features that are especially here to account for the fact that most of the time, most people using iPads don't have a hardware keyboard attached. And so Dorico for iPad was built with the assumption that sometimes you might have a keyboard attached, but sometimes you might not. So here we are at the beginning. You can see that I have this piano keyboard at the bottom of my screen. And if I double tap anywhere to start note entry, you can see that the caret comes up. You can also see there's a little button here on the left that lit up to indicate that I am in note entry as well. So that is kind of a replacement for hitting the return key on your keyboard. And this keyboard here at the bottom of my screen, I have a lot of control over it. I can move it higher or lower. If I start to type a note and I realize that that's not the note that I mean, I have this handy delete key here. And if I wanted to start entering notes, I could do that here. I'm going to switch to the bass clef. And in the piece that I am writing, both hands actually start in treble clef. So you can see I can come over here on the right and grab a treble clef symbol, and that works exactly the same way as that clef tool works on the desktop. And if I come back over to write mode, I can start typing some things in. So one thing that's pretty cool about the keyboard here is that if I have a smaller device or just bigger fingers and I want more space for each of those notes, I can drag around the range of the keyboard. So I want this to be about here. And another cool feature is that it is a polyphonic keyboard, multi-touch. So if I want to enter 2 notes at a time for a chord, I can actually just play them both here, which is pretty cool. And as you can see, the title here is Waltz, and I'm absolutely not in waltz time, and that's totally okay, because I have access to the meter tool over here. And I want to show you something else as well while we're here. If I jump back to the beginning, if I want to move my caret to the beginning, I have a few ways to do that. I can double tap, just the way I did to start note entry, but you can see I've got this little floating gray toolbar here. And this is a way of doing some things that we normally don't have access to, and I also have these arrow keys up at the top. So if I go back to the beginning with these arrow keys, I can get 3, 4. Now there's another way to do that I want to show you as well, and that is to use a popover. And popovers on the desktop version of Dorico usually require a keyboard. So if I wanted to enter the meter popover, that would be Shift-M to enter a meter. But since I don't have access to that, I have this little toggle here on the top right between the artist palette icon and the keyboard icon. And if I switch, notice that I get a slightly different set of buttons on the right side, and those all represent popovers. So if I wanted to invoke the meter popover, I can click this tool and notice that I get the meter popover in the software keyboard sliding up from the bottom. And so I can type the same way I would 3/4 to get 3/4 time here, which is pretty cool. I want to show you a couple of other things about note entry here. So if I go back into note entry mode, and if my piano keyboard doesn't come up on its own, I can pull it up by tapping this button in the bottom left. If I were writing for a guitar or percussion instrument, I might also want to take advantage of the fretboard or the drum pads. Those won't be an option since I'm writing for piano here. But now, since I'm writing in a slightly higher octave, I'm going to slide the piano keyboard up a little bit. And I'm going to use the rhythm values that are given to me right above the piano keyboard, very handy. And now another thing that I can do is, again, I get this light gray slide over thing, and these are a lot of tools that you might use normally from the keyboard that I don't have connected to my iPad right now. So if I wanted to extend this, these bottom 2 buttons on this gray palette will extend or shorten the note based on the rhythm grid. You can change the size of the rhythmic grid just like you can on the desktop. So if I wanted to make that a dotted half note, I could just, there's a dotted, a rhythm dot button here, but I could also just use the extend a little bit key down here, which frankly is how I usually enter dotted notes on the desktop anyway, is I enter the undotted note and then I extend the note. So now I continue entering some notes here. Again, this works exactly as it does on the desktop. Use that, oops, wrong button. That extension there. Now, I will say, if you do have a hardware keyboard attached, that's great. Let me grab my hardware keyboard over here. Now that I've got my keyboard attached, I can show you that if I wanted to enter something like fingering, using the fingering popover, I could use the button that's on the screen here, but if I have my keyboard attached, I can use the same keyboard shortcut, Shift-F, and if I need this to be played by 5, I can type that in, and there we have that exact same thing that we would have on the desktop. While we're speaking of keyboard shortcuts, I think something that's super cool about Dorico for the iPad is that it includes all of the keyboard shortcuts that you have on the desktop. In fact, you can even customize them the same way that you would on the desktop by going to the menu and looking at the preferences here. So on preferences, key commands, you can see that I have all of the same key command option functions that I have available on the desktop, which is super cool. While we're looking at menus, I also want to show you that I can go into notation options and I can go into layout options, and these are all basically identical to their desktop counterparts. And for me, the first time I was using this and the first time I opened the notation options on the iPad, that was when I knew that this application that I was using on my iPad is the same Dorico that I know and love on my Mac. I can come in here and change the settings for bar lines and some things that I like to mess with a lot, beam groupings. All of this stuff is right here in exactly the same way as it is on the desktop. Now, if you do have a hardware MIDI keyboard, either a Bluetooth keyboard or a USB MIDI keyboard that you can connect to your iPad, that will work too. So here I am back in note entry mode. I can still use the on-screen keys to select the rhythm values. If I want, I can open this version of it, which is a little bit more like the desktop version. They both work exactly the same way. But you can see as I do this, that's the right octave. Move that out of the way. The next new feature that is worth pointing out here in write mode is the key editor. And the key editor takes its name from Cubase. It's Cubase's version of a MIDI editor that's what some applications call a piano roll. And it's very similar to the kind of editor that we've seen in the past in Dorico, limited to the play mode. And this is a little bit like a mini version of play mode that's right here in write mode. And it works exactly as you would expect if you've ever used the similar thing in play mode. So here you can see there is a MIDI data representation of everything that's in my score. If I tap somewhere in the score, it will zoom to that part of the key editor. And so if I want to select a note and change something about it, I can do that very, very easily. If I wanted to take this C and move it up to a D, you can see that as I did that in the key editor, it automatically corrected it in the score itself. So let's move it back down. If I wanted to change the duration, I could grab the end of that note. And if I moved it here, you can see that it also changed the duration in the score. If you want to only change the duration in one place, you can switch from the notation to the sound here, and that will control two kind of separate features of the playback. And you can see below, I also have the opportunity to edit the note velocities. So you can see I can grab the note and drag it up and down to imitate that note being struck harder or more softly. Now, another very cool thing that's here. This is super nerdy, I'm gonna warn you. So the histogram here shows a distribution of all of the velocities of all of the notes in the passage that we're looking at. So you can see most of them are kind of in the middle. The velocities of notes in MIDI data range from 0 to 127, and so you can see on average we're kind of right in the middle, around 62.5. And we've got kind of a few getting fewer and fewer as we go out from that middle point. So I can change the high end, the high extreme, by moving it up and down. Do that. I can change the low end to make it more consistent. And the reason you might want to do this kind of editing is because it impacts the realistic nature of the computer performance. Humans don't play everything exactly the same way, and so by adding a small bit of subtle difference in the strength of each attack, we can make the playback sound more human. In fact, some sequencers and digital audio workstations refer to this feature as a humanization. So we can take this whole group and move it as a chunk to get it louder or softer. We can also scale it so that not only does it get louder, the distribution gets wider, or not only gets softer, but the distribution gets narrower, and that's what this percent does in the middle. See, if I move it down, they get softer and closer together. If I move it up, they get louder and farther apart. And then if I want to take this whole thing and randomize it, add some humanness to it, I can take this little shuffle icon here and drag it up to increase the randomness or down to bring it back. And so that is the histogram editor. I think this is a super cool feature that I don't even know of a lot of DAWs that include this kind of control. I think it's really cool that it's here in Dorico. I really look forward to hopefully seeing this on the desktop version of Dorico later. Right now, this is only here on the iPad. So we'll quickly take a look at the other modes. Write mode is obviously the one where you're likely to spend most of your time, and it's the one that has the most new features to account for the touch affordances that we need here when we don't have hardware attached. So if I go to Engrave Mode, you can see that this is a very limited version of Engrave Mode. I mentioned earlier that the iPad versions of Dorico are similar to Dorico SE and Dorico Elements on the desktop, which don't, at least as of right now, have any form of Engrave Mode. So this is Engrave Mode, but a limited version of it. You can see that by selecting something in the score, I still get all of the controls down here at the bottom in the Properties panel. So I still have a lot of control over what stuff looks like, which is a really useful thing. And I have the graphic editing mode, which is this button over here in the top left. So I can take an individual symbol, like say this fingering 5, and drag it around somewhere. I don't know why I would put it there, but I could, and it wouldn't do anything to impact the playback. Again, that's what Engrave Mode is for. Now, if you are a desktop Dorico user, you might notice that I don't have a lot of other features of Dorico in Engrave Mode here. So I can't change the vertical spacing between staves or systems. I can't change the horizontal rhythm spacing. I can't add or edit the frames that are here. Though you can see that there are frames here. These green and blue boxes here are frames on the page. I will say, if you open a Dorico project that was started on the desktop and has some of these spacing or frame edits in the file already, this will still render all of that correctly. It's not going to break anything. Just because you can't edit the master page or the frames or anything like that here doesn't mean that it's going to be dangerous to open one of those projects here on the iPad version of Dorico. The next thing to check out is play mode. Now, play mode I think is one that is here more or less out of a sense of completeness. You can have audio unit instruments. There aren't VSTs necessarily on the iPad version of Dorico, but audio units, which is Apple's kind of version of VSTs, do exist here. You can get instruments and effects in the App Store that work as audio units. There aren't nearly as many of them, obviously, as you would have on the desktop, and unfortunately, they're, at least in the ones that I've heard, not nearly as good. So I'm not going to delve into the features of play mode here. You can see that at the bottom we have many of the same features that we would have expected. This mixer, by the way, is the same as the mixer that you would see in the new version of write mode here on the desktop or on the iPad as well. Desktop Dorico users will probably notice that there is a mode that's missing here, and that is print mode. So there is no print mode here on Dorico for iPad. You can go to a printer, you can export as a PDF, but you don't have quite the granular control over those that you do on the desktop. If you need to do that, you can use the share button here to export audio, to export a PDF, to print. And this is, by the way, also where you would go if you've been working on a file on your iPad and you want to bring that file back to the desktop version of Dorico. This is where you would do that as well, from the Share menu and select Dorico Project. The other mode that is available to you on Dorico for iPad is one that does not exist at all on the desktop, and it's a little bit hidden because it doesn't have a tab like everything else, but if you go to the menu, you'll notice that there is a read option here, and read option will take you to read mode. And what read mode is kind of like a score reader. It's a little bit like a very, very, very simple version of something like Score or Music. Now, all it does right now is show you the pages of your score. You can turn pages with a Bluetooth foot pedal the same way you would in a score reader, but the big limitation here is that you cannot annotate your score. So you cannot write either with your finger or, better yet, with the Apple Pencil on your score. And that's a big drawback, I think, of Dorico for iPad in general, is that there's no way to do these kinds of natural annotations that are very idiomatic to the iPad on Dorico for iPad. And I would like to think that that's probably going to be a very common feature request, but for now I think of read mode as it currently exists as a really fast print preview. You can turn your iPad into portrait mode and see the score document without any of the editing user interface, pretty much as it would exist on a sheet of paper in something that more closely resembles the size of a sheet of paper. And so I think of it as a really quick print preview. So that really is going to do it for this quick tour of the Dorico for iPad features. If you have any questions or if you want some more details, I would encourage you to check out my full review over at scoringnotes.com. And if you have any questions, leave those in the comments either to this video or to that article. I would love to talk more about how you are interested in using Dorico and notation applications on your iPad. Thanks so much for watching.